Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of The Growth Show. We are being banished to our rooms where we're allowed to actually speak to each other. And today I'm joined with an expert panel of Tom Pickering and David Berkeley. And we're going to be exploring the role of a CEO, senior leader in these times. So David, just to kick us off, what do you see the roles of a CEO and sort of senior leader now from an emotional intelligence standpoint?
Yeah, good questioning. So I think right now, or generally, let's say, there's two ways that someone gets to be a senior leader. One, by bulldozing their way there, like a sort of bull in a china shop. They smash through people to get to their outcome. Or two, there's people who just get the best out of people around them. Now, let's just briefly talk about the former. The former are going to really struggle in this time because smashing your way through people to get to outcomes isn't going to work much more. It doesn't really work anymore. And so therefore, really developing, harnessing emotional intelligence is so important. Unlike intellectual intelligence, emotional intelligence can actually change a lot during a lifetime. Intellectual intelligence, I'll get my words out, by the age of about 20, 21, is pretty much there. Like that's it. That's you done for life. Whereas emotional intelligence can really be developed and harnessed. So for people who are sort of getting to a point now where they feel like they're hitting a wall and what they're doing isn't working anymore, you've probably got to look at A, what got you to that point, and then B, what are you going to need to get from that point on? And emotional intelligence is really fun. So I do these sort of really thick 38-page reports to everybody when we work with them. And it also shows what people do under pressure. And this is probably a pretty good time to see what people do under pressure. And it really kind of highlights strengths, but also potential real weaknesses in what people do. So I'd encourage people to go, right, what got me to this point? And is doing that going to help get me forward? If you're naturally a good people person, you've got high emotional intelligence, double down on that. Really look at that and how you can really harness that to manage your own state during this time, but also how you can best get the best out of your team in high pressure, high stress situations, which we're in the middle of right now. Yeah,
absolutely. And Tom, are you seeing many blind spots that leaders and CEOs are ignoring at the moment?
Yeah, I think picking up what David said, I think this is a difficult situation, and the acid test of any leader, as David just said, is how do they respond to that? So I think that the challenge is how do leaders adjust, and I think it's a bit like analogy which is around a jazz band that improvises without any music, and actually just taking the feedback, and I think that's the challenge. Versus the old archetype of leader, which is the conductor, where in fact the music is it's largely become redundant, and maybe nobody wants to hear it. And I think there's some really difficult business issues which need to be faced over the last sort of 40 years or so, which are substantial. And actually, I think what's happened is because the wind has been a bit of a tailwind for a long period of time, burning a lot of resources. There's some interesting stats that actually there's very little correlation between the CEO's performance and the performance of the organisation, because it's a bit like a boat, just been blown with the wind behind it for a long period of time. And there's another stat as well that only 4% of leaders actually spend any time on the on actually thinking beyond the business as usual. So in fact, they've got very little time. They to actually do development work. So there's a real practical challenge with time. I think the blind spot is a bit different. So I think it's about how do we become aware of the issues that are around us. And there's some of the language is really because we've been doing quite a few things wrong for a long period of time. There's in the background there's a bit of a machine, a PR machine, which makes things okay and normalizes things. And the oil industry has been absolutely behind that for years. And I think we've got that down to quite a fine art. So, you can see this in some of the redefining truths, some of the fears of upsetting people, the Boris Johnson statement of the assumption that somehow the economy is going to bounce back, which all justify the status quo, when in fact the challenge is pretty difficult. and the window is fairly narrow. And I think the other thing, from our analysis most recently, is that we actually all of a sudden need to become very joined up. And this is a joined upness between the public sector and the private sector, both of whom historically have, not necessarily been shining examples of making things happen. So I think within this, Nick, it requires real courage to face up to this. It requires real courage to admit, to the scale of some of these issues. And there's a substantial amount of courage then to reset the new now and the targets, and to go back to your teams and say, look, I'm terribly sorry, we've got this rather wrong. So there's a number of things which this is all in an environment where people are actually quite uncertain, Nick, as well. So an uncertainty creates fear, and this is the seedbed, as David knows as well as anybody else, for people naturally burying their heads in the sand. Yeah.
And David, coming back to your sort of earlier point of people referring to type, is authenticity a key aspect now people should be focusing on when it comes to their leadership?
Big time. I think most leaders, here's a controversial statement, most leaders aren't actually that authentic. I think people hide behind the fears of being found out, or fears of things they can't do, or suddenly someone comes in a room and someone, leader says something and someone goes, absolute nonsense, I've got a doctorate in that, they're spouting absolute, and their whole world kind of crumbles around them. And if going from that point, you then layer that on with trying to overcompensate in other areas. And one of the big misconceptions that people have is actually authenticity, showing vulnerability to your team, is a massive strength. It's not at all a weakness. I had a client for a few weeks, a few years ago, and we worked together for a few weeks. And I walked in and he dressed as a tech startup, raised millions. He dressed like Steve Jobs. He acted like Steve Jobs. Certainly nobody liked him in the office. I walked in and it was like a morgue. I kid you not. It was like a morgue going in. I just thought something horrific had happened in the office. And that's just what it was like. He ruled by fear. He'd go up to managers and say, I need names of 3 people in your team because they need to get fired, to show everybody else that they need to work harder. I was like, if you don't get that authenticity right, if you're not being that person, then you're going to really, really struggle, because you're trying to mask and be somebody you thought was really successful, and it's not going to work well.
Right. And he had convinced himself in his head he was this person having this impact. So there was a big disconnect from the reality.
Yes. Well, he just thought that's how you need to be to run a successful tech company. You need to be like Steve Jobs. Well, the problem is that Steve Jobs became Steve Jobs when Apple was big. I can't imagine he acted like that on the way through, and he sort of built this persona around it. But that was him. That's how he got success. That's how he got results in terms of who he was. But a lot of people aren't like that. So work out who you really are. What are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? How can you bring that to the team, for the betterment of yourself and for everybody else?
Yeah. And Tom, I think leading on from one of David's points there seems like there is opportunity. I know there's a few things we're focusing on that are negative, and we actually have to make sure we're addressing them as leaders. But there does seem like there is actually quite a lot of opportunity out there to be seized upon. What's the few of the opportunities you're seeing?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing, Nick, is to free up your time. So very practically, leaders have got to start considering the capability they've got and reinventing that over the next 12-month cycle. So, pragmatically, if you look at historically what CEOs have done, is they've managed current assets. And, if you take a company like JLR or Debenhams, those assets become defunct, unless you're ahead of the game, both good and bad. So there are good opportunities and there are bad opportunities, both of which you need to stay ahead of the curve of. And certainly when I was working as a VP in Lexar, even 15 years ago, I was looking at this window in a fast growth tech company, thinking about what's the capability and actually exiting certain capabilities to bring on new capabilities. And you've got to have the time to do that. And you can't afford to get it wrong. But as I say, the reality though is that leaders really have no time in the day to do that. But that's the opportunity. But if you get that right, I think that's exciting. I think the other thing is, from a people perspective, as David just mentioned, when you get the people side of the business, you move away from that awful silence, because actually what does not good look like? It's that silence that David just described. And, there's some really straightforward things that leaders can do there, which is admit to making mistakes, because if a leader doesn't make mistakes, no one else is going to admit to them. There's some really practical things that, humility, to acknowledge this particular situation, as well as, the realities of what's come out the new now. So, there's some really strong people aspects of this, and yet people go back to the old mantras of, growth. Everyone goes back to growth. Growth is the thing that since the 1970s has trashed the planet, and we still go back to growth. And there's a lot of focus on technology, being the answer to everything. Technology is not the answer to everything. You don't need a computer system to tell you not to chop down trees in the Amazon. Just don't chop down trees in the Amazon. Don't even need to count them. So there's these mantras that are still pervasive, Nick, that people need to understand what's driving them. How do they get? I mean, David mentioned this. Now, how do leaders get to where they've got to? And so the specific question I ask in relation to that is, what are the challenges? What are the actions that people took? Then you can see the thinking. How do they get to where they've got to? But we're in a situation where these mantras are still. We've got this nasty bit in the middle of COVID-19 and some sort of hump, but there's very little change. Something's gone up and down, but there's really substantial fundamental change and rethinking that's got to take place here. Otherwise, there's going to be some very nasty surprises. And for those that aren't prepared, I'm really concerned, Nick, because there's nothing worse than something that you're not aware of that hits you. It's one thing being aware of something, but if you don't have the time in the day to think about this, you don't know how to create the time in the day to think about this and or plan for this, I can't see a great outcome. That said, there are some people who are continue sailing with the wind behind them. Some businesses are growing up. Children's products are very resilient in recessions. Health products are doing very well at the moment. So some markets still carrying on, but there's a market for vehicles, there's a market for aircraft, but not as you know it, Jim. So those businesses will probably go down, but actually they need to fundamental rethink. And this is the thinking, the driving, what drives us, and also our self-awareness. So if I say something to you, Nick, that might upset you, am I aware enough to actually understand what to do about that? And how can I adjust my style to, get that right next time? And that's all around our self-awareness of ourselves. Listening to people is very, very important. And the fundamental expectation of a leader is just not historically what people have been trained to do. I think it is this orchestrator. It's about having these intimate relationships with people. I mean, a friend of mine was talking about sailing yachts just recently. He's a very good sailor. And he was talking about, the ability to anticipate the wind, changing, something I never got right on a boat. But actually there's that feeling and the whole team just adjust, immediately. It's that orchestration, it's that anticipation. It's about listening. It's about those intimate relationships. And you break down the communication and you're into a very nasty set of surprises.
Yeah. I've said this before, and I said this to my management team, where my biggest fear at the moment is not evolving. If we had an instant spike back, and I wish that on every business, instantly spike back to where they are. But I think for a few, that's quite dangerous. I think just saying like, oh, that's fine, that's fine, back to normal, no changes, no time to reflect, and then just carry on as normal. I think that will build up more and more and more and come to hit them. And I think much as there are a few businesses who are experiencing real pain, they will come out, if they actually spend the time, actually taking the time to assess their business, repivot it, make the right decisions, they will come out stronger for it with a more unique proposition. But I do fear for people who just sort of plow on, and especially sales-led business where all they know is, you just do more sales, and it'll be fine. It's going to take a bit more time to reflect. And I think your stat of I think 4% or how many leaders used to spend time stepping away from their business and thinking about it is something I think every leader can reflect. I think holidays for most people are the time they get most of their good work done for actually assessing what they're doing with their business. That probably should be a core allotted time during their paid time to do. And I also think leaders, it's a brave statement in this sort of intense work culture we put on ourselves, just to say, hey, I'm just going to go off and think for a day. I think that takes a fairly brave leader to go and say, this is a strategy day for us to do. I think there's a bit of peer pressure not to be doing that.
You know why that is, Nick? Sorry, just to jump in on that.
So why is that?
The reason why we have our best thoughts on holiday is because we get rid of all the noise in our head. So day to day, most leaders have got so many things going on in their head. They've a million and one things to do. There's, before you even start the day, there's probably 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 emails just to reply to. It takes, as soon as something breaks your concentration, it takes 23 minutes to get back into flow on that. So most people work phenomenally efficiently because they're constantly having their thought process interrupted. And when most people go, well, I need to take a day out from the business to think strategically, it's not quality time because you're unwinding from that stress. So you're unwinding from all the sort of background noise and chatter. And so usually, if you actually track it, people's really good ideas on holiday come on day 2, 3, 4. Day 2, they'll get their first inklings. Day 3, they wake up and go, oh, I've got this. Oh, where's a pen and paper? There isn't one in the villa. They'll, scramble. And then this will start firing emails back to the office. And then when you get back to it, you're back into all the emails and everything, and it's very hard to get change. One of the things that I say to all my leaders, if you could have 15 minutes a day, put your feet on your desk, close the door, put a sign on it saying, do not come in unless the building's on fire. If you just had 15, 20 minutes, 30 minutes a day, just to think, right, where do I want this business to be in 5 years' time, 3 weeks' time, whatever it is. Or even just pick a person in your business going, where do I want them to be? What does excellent look like for them? It will revolutionize your business because it cuts down all the kind of noise and chatter in our head. And that's why we get the really good ideas when we're on holiday, when we're on the beach, when we're sleeping better. That's why.
Yeah, when you break it down like that, it doesn't seem like a huge amount of time, but we all know that we don't do it, right? We don't do it enough. It's a bit like breathing. We all know to breathe, and we're fairly decent at it. But when you go and work with a real breath coach, it transforms your life. You're actually conscious of how you're breathing. Tom, what else? What we talked about other opportunities. Are there any other opportunities you've sort of seen that people should be focusing on right now as leaders?
Yeah. So I think it is important. No, the day-to-day has to be managed very, very carefully, Nick. So I think that there's a discipline that sits around that. But I think this is in terms of leaders' challenge is to let go, and the challenge is for them to be able to do nothing, and that requires a bit of a mindset shift. So that, in terms of putting other people first, letting people do their jobs, these all require courage. Decide what's got to happen. That's got to be different. What is the core business? And then set up team reviews so there's a place for everything, and then manage the gap. So if anything comes back to me, it's like a boomerang. It goes back to somebody else. And then you've got to let people do things in their own way. And when you start doing that, the results start flowing in, but also you get to this point of this jazz band that frankly plays itself, and you don't even need to be much of an orchestra. I think what does happen then is that sometimes you get the what wrong, or it becomes defunct, and you need to say, look, guys, I'm sorry, and this has happened to me from time to time. We haven't wasted our time, but we've got this a bit wrong. And sometimes when things get difficult, people feel that that's wrong, and a lot of that's due to thinking. So people will think, no, this just feels wrong because it's difficult, and that's actually okay. And there's a time when CEO's role is actually to steer the ship into the wind for an extended period of time, and it's difficult. And that largely is about leaving the ownership with people to think things through. But when people get past that, that's a very exciting place to be, Nick. So. And I think the acid test of this is also when you start doing that, you develop grit in the team as you're letting people be themselves. They're beginning to feel big and strong, rather than being told what to do, they're doing things off their own bat. They're also being supported, and there's a loving framework around them. They've got the tools to do their job. The organisation is aligned. And this is all about creating new action, and the thing that creates new action creates grit, but it's the thinking that creates the new action. So you do need to change the thinking. So if there's one thing that shouldn't be underestimated here, is the link between the challenge of identifying the thinking, addressing the thinking, to change the action. So I think out of that, you're also engaging the people who really care in an organisation, because what you do need to do, and David talked about the people who go silent, the worst people to go silent are the people who care. They become subversive, right? So, and this is all silent subversion, or they leave, or something unfortunate happens. Some unfortunate incident at the photocopier occurs. It's only because people care. So, and then within this, I think the other thing to watch out for is most people will follow something that's completely wrong. So the Ash experiment suggests, which is a well-founded thing, is that most people will follow and do something wrong, and it is those people who care who will steer the ship in the right direction. So when you get this right, you find the right people come to the fore, who then come to the fore, have got the courage to say, look, that's, start speaking up and actually getting quite animated about things and saying, look, I don't like that. They don't even need to be articulate. They just need to say, look, I'd stop, that's what you want to hear. Then you can try and understand what they're trying to articulate, and to encourage people to, in fact, even not be articulate, to say, look, that's wrong. And then when you get to that point, you've got a point for critical thinking. Then you say, right, we need to look at this, and have that integrity and the openness. And so, that's getting close to a jazz band, and it's a very motivating jazz band that's improvising, that's adjusting. It's a very exciting place to be, Nick. But to get to that place, you've got to let go, and you've got to get used to taking new action. You've got to get used to managing that situation, because that's actually quite difficult, because it's a threat to. I find it difficult myself, but I've achieved it on several occasions. This is the way I turn business around. And when it gets to that point, it gets a life of its own. You think, hold on a minute, who's steering this ship? And you've got to, you just sort of step back, and then you're watching the longer time frame. So there's some practical things. The organisation, these things have to be in place to create this this mindset shift and create the time. And I think part of this isn't something that I've completely forgotten about, which is actually managing by exception as well. So, and I think the other thing that's happened as well is that it's very important to understand what's happening at grassroots level. A lot of organisations have always dealt with the senior management. I've always wanted to go down to the shop floor and say, look, what are you struggling with? What help do you need? And then grab help of an engineer to make sure they've got the support. And I think that with the emphasis on the emphasis on the frontline workers, that's become far more important. In terms of the credibility of the CEO and the organisation, because it doesn't take much to tip the balance between some very unpleasant social media explosion and actually something that's very good. And the difference between that is actually humility. But the minute you get this wrong, you get the communication wrong, and you say, look, I'm never wrong. You've got a large target on your back. And I think it's a very fine dividing line. So I think it's about this humbleness. It's about this thing that we've talked about before, Nick, about getting used to imposter syndrome, getting comfortable with it, and being absolutely reliant on your team. I mean, total reliance on your team. And your sole role is there to help the team achieve their objectives, and also to be there as long as you need to be. So for me, I realized in 2005, 2006, I had a finite life cycle for what I was doing. I'm good for about 12 months, but the challenge changes. And I think within this, there are very few. I quite often fire people because when we raise the bar, people haven't got the capability to take this journey, Nick. So you need to watch that capability. As I said, not just the business assets, but the capability assets, because you do find that some people can't make that journey. Some people are in the wrong role, but some people won't. You need to make some tough calls. So when you get this right, it's got a whole new dynamic. But it's certainly not about Tom. It's about the organisation. It's about what's right for the organisation. And it's a very unegotistical place to be. And it's quite scary. It scares me. I like a challenge.
Yeah, I think again, something I think we should explore another time is when you have identified a skills gap, right? When you've seen an area of business that needs addressing, how open are people to actually being able to be trained into those roles, and how do leaders approach that? How do they even make an assessment to go, is this external? Is this something we can't train? Or is this person open to being developed?
Yeah,
right. As I've seen lots of businesses spend a year and a half to do a crucial change project, taking someone who's never experienced that piece of work, and you've just basically in that time lost a year and a half.
Yeah.
And how they know to assess someone, can they adapt to a new role?
Yeah.
is key. And I think with both of you guys, I think we're very well positioned to explore that a bit more.
Yeah.
But I think I don't know what time it is, so I think we've whizzed through that. That was great. It's very hard trying to condense down these conversations into half an hour, whatever we tried to go for there. Thank you to both of you again for that. Thanks everyone at home for joining the YouTube channel, all the support, all the questions, all the debates. We are really enjoying it, and we have a few exciting new announcements to bring you in the near future. But thanks to the panel, great debate, and we will speak to you all very soon. Take care. Bye-bye.